Welcome back to this evening's edition of the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. And today, as our intro video suggests, we are talking about the Vietnam War, but not just Vietnam. What we're also talking about here is American imperialism and the history of that imperialism and how it eventually got us not just into Vietnam, but also into other conflicts around the world over the previous 2 centuries. Now, one of the things that's really important about not just Vietnam, but American imperialism is, like everything else in US and world history, this too has a context. And we've got to go way back to have a full understanding of that particular context. But unlike most of our classes, I want to start tonight's class in the here and now. So let me show you a map, first off, of American military installations around the world. This map is up to date as of, I believe, either 2023 or 2024. So this particular map shows just how many American bases there are around the world as of today. And as you can see, there are installations on virtually every continent except Antarctica. And it's worth noting this map isn't even complete because there may be some installations that the Pentagon has not publicly acknowledged. I can tell you a personal story about this. If you look at the giant star in Germany, that's actually where I was born in 1986, thanks to the Cold War. My mother was born in Guam, over here, again, thanks to the Cold War and American imperialism. One of my closest friends who's in the Army, has been deployed to both sub-Saharan Africa and South America. And in both cases, he could not tell me which country he was actually in. He could only simply say, I am on this continent. That's all I can tell.
My father was Shanghai Jeff's dentist from 1954 to 58. I was not quite woke yet at the time.
So there you go. Again, the Cold War era has produced many strange bedfellows in American and world history, and has even caused some people's fathers to vote for Chiang-Kai-shek, which is, again, you gotta write a memoir or something, because this stuff is just too good to not be passed down from generation to generation. But if you're wondering about how we got to this point of there being all these installations, part of the story is the Cold War, but the much larger story is thinking about the history of American imperialism. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight, before, of course, getting into Vietnam. Now, one mistake that you don't want to make, though, is to simply see this as a story about just the 20th century. The story of American imperialism is quite literally as old as the nation itself. And in a lot of ways, when we're talking about Vietnam, we're also talking about things such as the dispossession of indigenous lands, the War of 1898, and so forth. And so to give us some sense of how we got to the point of intervening in Vietnam, I felt it was important to first give some context for the broader history of American imperialism. Now, I love maps. I love using maps in history courses, partly because I believe that maps like this one help us tell a much fuller and complicated story. This is how the United States essentially expanded from sea to shining sea in the course of the 19th century. Of course, you see the original United States as of 1783, and the eventual acquisition of land from France, from Spain, the annexation of Texas, further territory conquered from Mexico, and territory also acquired from the British in 1846. Now, what is worth noting, however, is that even though most of this map shows territories being acquired from European nations, let's not forget that there were indigenous peoples living in all of these lands during that time period. And I'm sure it was a mere oversight. Indigenous peoples were not present at the negotiations for these lands. And so the United States also has a long history of conflict against the indigenous peoples. In fact, you can make an argument that one of the first jobs of the federal government was territorial expansion and acquisition in the 18th and 19th centuries. And while Americans are often familiar with battles such as Yorktown from the Revolutionary War or Gettysburg from the American Civil War, for indigenous peoples, battles such as the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794 or the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 represent moments where indigenous peoples actually triumphed over the United States military in combat. Despite that, of course, in the long run, the United States would acquire all of these territories, oftentimes via armed force, also in many cases breaking treaties in order to acquire more land and more territory. Now, the excuses given for this territorial acquisition were many. Sometimes it was going back to European colonization. The excuse was spreading Christianity, or the search for gold, or simply acquiring more land. For the United States in the 19th century, the chief reason was the acquisition of territory. They believed in ideas such as manifest destiny, or this concept that, in essence, God had ordained that the United States had a God-given right and responsibility to expand across the North American continent. In fact, that idea of manifest destiny would be a key driver in U.S. foreign policy throughout a great deal of the 19th century. Also, you can't ignore the fact that ideas about race and identity played a key role as well. In this case, assumptions by white Americans that they were superior to and could educate indigenous peoples on how to be properly civilized. Now, I, being a native of Georgia, am very familiar with the story of the Cherokee Nation, which was driven out of Georgia in the 1830s because it was believed there was gold on Cherokee territory. Cherokee Nation was forced to leave Georgia despite the fact that they had indeed, quote unquote, civilized, creating a written language, having their own newspaper, even allowing for the owning and selling of slaves in their territory. None of that saved them from Georgia state government or from the actions of then President Andrew Jackson, who was totally fine with Georgia basically ejecting the Cherokee Nation out of Georgia. If you're familiar with the Seminole tribe in Florida, they had a similar fate as well. The Seminoles actually fought back against the U.S. Army in a decade-long guerrilla war fought primarily in Florida. Again, these are conflicts that are not very well remembered in American history because they are not the pretty fanciful conflicts of the Revolutionary War or the Civil War. But these conflicts of American imperialism are very important for us to understand. Another key concept that's important to U.S. foreign policy is the idea of the Monroe Doctrine, first set out by President James Monroe in 1823. In essence, the doctrine argued that the Western Hemisphere was the exclusive playground of the United States, that European powers had no rights, no opportunity to interfere in the affairs of nations in the Western Hemisphere, because, well, that was our job. Now, in the 19th century, the Monroe Doctrine was a doctrine most European nations ignored because the United States did not have the ability to actually enforce this doctrine. But European nations in the 19th century were also heavily distracted by their own wars and conflicts in Europe and elsewhere. But by the 20th century, the Monroe Doctrine had real teeth, thanks to the growth and the expansion of the United States Navy. This cartoon, in fact, is from 1904 or so, and it shows the Monroe Doctrine on the hulls of two U.S. Navy battleships. And if you're looking at the side here, you see the nations of Germany, Great Britain, France, and I think that might be Russia on the end, I'm not quite sure, all kind of looking out towards the ocean and noticing that the Monroe Doctrine has real firepower behind it. But again, what you're seeing here is not just the United States proclaiming the Western Hemisphere to be free of European domination. It's also showing that the Western Hemisphere is now safe for American domination. And this domination would best manifest itself in the War of 1898, aka the Spanish-American War. Now, the United States entered the war in 1898 purportedly to save Cuban civilians from atrocities being committed by the government of Spain. In actuality, in the decade leading up to the Spanish-American War, many American foreign policymakers, especially those in the Republican Party, were looking at the Caribbean as a prime place to really grow ideas of American imperialism. At the same time, American policymakers also had one eye on the Pacific Ocean, seeing it as a potential avenue for more American commerce, diplomacy, and trade. The War of 1898 allowed the U.S. to, as the saying goes, kill two birds with one stone. We were able to expand our sphere of influence in the Caribbean by not only liberating Cuba from Spanish control, but also conquering Puerto Rico, while at the same time also taking control of the Philippines from Spain. Keep in mind, Spain had had a presence in the Philippines since the 16th century, and now that it come to a decisive end. Now, most Americans, I think, are aware of this war primarily because of Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders who fought in Cuba. Or they may be aware of the war because of Puerto Rico's status as a commonwealth within the United States government. But the Philippines, I think, actually has the most relevance for tonight's class. Because of the war we fought there after the Spanish-American War. The Philippine-American War, or sometimes referred to in the U.S. as the Philippine War, is one of those conflicts that, frankly, should be better known amongst Americans. The principal part of the war was fought for 3 years, but some historians argue it lasted until about 1913 because of various insurgencies in the Philippine Islands. But in the Philippine-American War, upwards of maybe 4,000 to 5,000 American soldiers were killed, along with tens of thousands of Filipino insurgents. And we estimate that there may have been up to 250,000 Filipino civilians who were killed in this war as well. Now, during the war, which was fought under the administrations of William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, the American military resorted to using torture and terrorism to fight against the Filipino insurgency. For example, if any of you remember from the war in Iraq, the technique known as waterboarding, which was used against Iraqi insurgents in the war in Iraq. That technique where you strap someone down to a table and you pour water in their mouths until they literally cannot breathe anymore. They feel like they're drowning. That technique was first used in this war over a century ago. Some American soldiers came to see the war as a blight on American society. In fact, there were even stories of at least 1 or 2 Black soldiers defecting from the American Army and fighting alongside the Filipinos because of the fact that white soldiers in the U.S. Army often referred to Filipino insurgents by a certain racial slur. I think you know which one I'm talking about. But this war in the Philippines was also deeply opposed by many Americans. In the early 20th century, there was a formation what was known as the Anti-Imperialist League. And figures such as W.E. Du Bois and Mark Twain, you see here, were part of that Anti-Imperialist League. In fact, Twain wrote a short story called The War Prayer, which he wrote in 1905, but was not released until after his death. In it, Twain talks about how he was deeply opposed to war, and the War Prayer is actually set in an American church, where the parishioners are celebrating American patriotism and American prowess in combat. But Twain has his main character give a prayer where he talks about the virtues of slaughtering and killing one's enemies, causing mayhem around the world, and the parishioners are dumbfounded by his prayer. But worth noting, Twain did not publish this until after he was dead. After that, he didn't publish it when the war was actually going on, because even Mark Twain thought this might be too hot even for me to actually talk about publicly. But what's worth noting is that there are many prominent Americans who spoke out against imperialism in the early 20th century. Perhaps no one was more important to this anti-imperialist sentiment than Marine Corps General Smedley Butler, who in the 1930s wrote a book called War is a Racket. Now, in the aftermath of the Great War, by the 1930s, many Americans began to question America's imperial ambitions abroad, especially because of the carnage wrought by the Great War and its aftermath. And General Butler's book, War is a Racket, makes it quite clear that he felt, as a member of the Marine Corps, he agreed with many Americans who felt that America's imperialism was not for the better. And what I want to do now for just a quick moment is to show you the beginning of his book, War is a Racket. Because again, the book is an extraordinary piece of literature that's worth talking about. Yeah, it's also linked in the study guide as well. So I would, if you have time, I would advise you to at least read some of it, if not all of it. But the book starts off like this. It says, war is a racket. It always has been. It is the oldest, it is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. And as he goes on to say later on, how many of these war millionaires from the Great War shouldered a rifle? How many of them dug a trench? How many of them knew what it meant to go hungry in a rat-infested dugout? How many of them spent sleepless, frightened nights ducking shells and shrapnel and machine gun bullets? How many of them parried a bayonet thrust of an enemy? How many of them were wounded or killed in battle? So again, these are the kinds of questions that Americans have often offered about war and what we now refer to today as the military-industrial complex. But these questions are being raised throughout US history. And I think that's, again, worth noting that by the time we get to Vietnam, there are already some examples of resistance to war. Now, the thing about Butler's critique of American military and foreign policy in the 1930s is that for many Americans, it gets subsumed by concerns about isolationism and eventually our intervention in World War II. Now, this map was actually made by the US Navy in 1943 or so, really detailing how the United States was not only at the center of a worldwide conflict, but was at the center of worldwide trade networks as well, trying to make it clear that the Second World War was a war of absolute necessity, that the US had to fight it. But even as early as 1943, there were men in the US government who were asking themselves the question, what happens after this war is over? What kind of a world are we going to build for ourselves and our children once Nazism and fascism are defeated by the force of arms? Now, fortunately or unfortunately for us, one of the men involved in that post-war question was our good friend, Jimmy Burns, who served as Secretary of State right after World War II. And actually, this is a photograph from a meeting of the three foreign ministers or secretaries of state from the three major powers who fought for the Allies in World War II. There's Foreign Minister Molotov on the left, James Burns in the center, and Britain's Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden on the right. Now, these three men all played an integral role in creating the post-war world, but in particular, Secretary of State Burns played a key role in the lead up to what we now know, of course, as the Cold War, where the United States and its allies in Western Europe and elsewhere were united in their opposition to communism, represented by the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. But to understand the Cold War, we need to also think about this longer history of American imperialism. In the 20th century, the United States government often thought of itself as a hegemonic power in the Western Hemisphere, having complete domination of our hemisphere. And if you think about the world wars in that context, American intervention makes all the more sense to prevent, say, the rise of a hegemonic or superpower in Europe, in Germany, in both world wars, or in Japan in the Second World War in the Asia Pacific region. And now with the Cold War in the late 1940s beginning as well, US foreign policy leaders saw the Soviet Union as a major threat to US hegemony in Europe and Asia. Again, Jimmy Burns played a key role in the early years of the Cold War. And again, I want to note that Cold War policy is being built in part by a South Carolinian. Again, we talked a lot about Jimmy Burns' relationship to domestic policy the last few classes. This is again demonstrating Jimmy Burns' importance to US foreign policy as well. Between being a champion, use of the atom bomb against the Japanese at the end of World War II, and his support for a hardline anti-communist stance in the early days of the Cold War, Secretary of State James Burns played a major role in making sure that the Cold War actually kicked off in the first place. Now, during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies, but after the war was over, the two nations returned to their pre-war status of being really two nations that deeply distrusted one another. And again, we could spend a whole class talking about why the Soviet Union did not trust the US and vice versa. It is worth noting, and I can talk about this more in the Q&A at the end of class, that as early as 1917, 1918, the US military actually did launch an intervention into Russia during their civil war that we'd never talk about, where the US military actually helped occupy a couple of Russian ports, tried to ship weapons to anti-communist forces in Russia, and the Soviet government never forgot that. In fact, there's a story that in the 60s, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev on the floor of the United Nations referenced this intervention, and most Americans had no idea what he was talking about because it's American history and we aren't very good at that in the United States. But I digress. And really, the Cold War also represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between the US government and its military and foreign policy establishments. Again, the Pentagon, for example, that you see here, it was built during World War II, and it wasn't actually finished until the war was actually over with. But it became one of the key points of interest in the National Security Act of 1947, which, amongst other things, created the CIA and changed the Department of War into the Department of Defense. In both cases, the National Security Act, what you see is the US government really adopting a forceful peacetime stance in terms of building up the armed forces for potential combat. Before this, the United States had a long tradition of drawing down military forces during peacetime. Although it's worth noting, if you talk to indigenous peoples, they may have a very different conception of what peacetime is in the 19th century. Nonetheless, the National Security Act, the creation of NATO in 1949, really showed how the US government was growing the power of its foreign and military establishment in the face of what they saw as the threat of communism. And in fact, during the Cold War, the 1950s, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, you see the CIA becoming heavily involved in overthrowing governments around the world. For example, in Guatemala and Iran, those governments were overthrown by CIA-backed coups, where forces on the ground, in the case of both governments, they were seen as being too left-wing, too populist in orientation, and too hostile to the interests of American business and government. And in both Iran and Guatemala, those governments were overthrown in the early 1950s in the name of securing democracy against communism. Again, this is showing how the Cold War is really being used as a way for the US to be more aggressive in its foreign policy aims. And I think it's very easy to recognize why in both Latin America and the Middle East, the United States is still seen with a lot of suspicion today, in part because of actions in Iran and Guatemala in the 1950s and going forward. Another key proponent of the Cold War, by the way, worth mentioning is Strom Thurmond, a good and dear friend of the Modjeska School. Now, you're going to see a clip of Strom Thurmond in a few minutes talking about Vietnam and the Cold War, but it's worth noting that while we remember Thurmond best for his outspoken, well, put it lightly, criticism of the civil rights movement, Thurmond was also one of the most ardent Cold warriors in Congress. He was a staunch supporter of growing the defense budget throughout his tenure in the Senate. And he was also very outspoken in his support for the Vietnam War and other American interventions during the Cold War era. I want to think about how those two things were tied together, by the way. Thurmond's opposition to civil rights at home and his support for armed intervention abroad. And that is not a coincidence. Although I will point out one irony here, then I'll go on. Where Thurmond was very much a champion of American superpower status during the Cold War years, his predecessor, Ben Tillman, was actually a critic of American imperialism, especially during the Spanish-American War, because Tillman did not want to add more people of color to the United States. So go figure, right? It's one of those weird things. Again, think about this for a second. You have Ben Tillman and Mark Twain and W.B. Du Bois all agreeing imperialism is bad. 2 out of 3 ain't bad, I suppose, but I digress. Even with the Vietnam War itself, you don't want to forget that the principal general in charge of the war in its first few years, General William Westmoreland, was actually a native of Spartanburg, South Carolina. General Westmoreland became recognized as one of the architects of the Vietnam War. And I think along with Robert McNamara and Presidents Johnson and Nixon, they are some of the most prominent faces we see when talking about the Vietnam conflict in the 1950s, 60s, and early 1970s. Fun fact, Westmoreland would later run for governor of South Carolina in 1974 and would actually lose in the Republican primary. Now, what got us into Vietnam? And I'm not going to ask you to spell out any cuss words before we get into this, but what is important to note is that the Vietnam War was not just about Vietnam, at least not from the point of view of Americans. During the Eisenhower administration, foreign policy analysts began to construct what they refer to as the domino theory of foreign policy in Asia. Basically, their idea was this. They were concerned that if one nation fell to communism in East Asia, it would lead to the growth of communism throughout the entire Asian continent. And for many American foreign policy experts, they believed that stopping communism in Vietnam was important to save Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, now Myanmar, India, and Bangladesh from communist domination. Political cartoons in the 1950s and 60s often portrayed communism as an octopus, spreading its tentacles all over the world, including through the Asia-Pacific region. And there was a fear that if Vietnam went red one year, the next thing we know, you would have communism reigning from Moscow to Tokyo, and every point in between would be under communist domination. And so after Vietnam won its independence from France in 1954, Americans began to look at Vietnam as a potential hotspot for trouble, especially in its relationship to communism. Now, there is, of course, a great irony to this, and I'll turn the floor to Brett to talk about the war itself. Ho Chi Minh, who is considered by many the father of modern-day Vietnam and was the leader of Vietnam's independence movement, had actually at one point been an ally of the United States during World War II. During that war, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, sent operatives into French Indochina, now Vietnam, to help the Vietnamese forces fight against Japanese occupation during the war. Now, Ho Chi Minh had expressed to his American colleagues and allies an interest in American democracy, an interest in how America ran its own affairs. In fact, when Vietnam released its Declaration of Independence in 1945, declaring independence from France in the aftermath of World War II, their document began with a few familiar words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They lifted word for word from the American Declaration of Independence, in part because they were genuinely inspired by the ideas and concepts behind that document. Even OSS agents reporting back to then President Truman after World War II argued that it made the most sense to support Ho Chi Minh. That Vietnam, while they may have had some communists in their midst, they weren't really concerned with the Cold War. The Vietnamese simply wanted independence for the first time in a very, 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 very long time. Vietnam's history was one replete with domination by China, France, Japan, and France again. And they simply wanted to be their own nation state. However, thanks to needing French support during the Cold War in Europe, Presidents Truman, later Eisenhower, and then Kennedy, and eventually Johnson and Nixon, would toss their support behind trying to create an anti-communist South Vietnam, and in the process helping to foment a war that for the Vietnamese people would last for 20 years, and for the United States would last almost a decade. Funny enough, and I'll leave you with this, in the United States, we call this the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, it is known as the American War. It's all about perspective, ladies and gentlemen. And speaking of perspective, Brett is now going to talk a bit about the actual war itself.
Do we want to, I would like to see the Thurman clip or Thurman.
Oh, sure thing.
Threatened me. And if there are any questions before we move away from this historic trend that America has established in terms of their foreign policy, ask them now, and there'll be plenty of opportunity later.
All right, so the clip you are about to see is old Strom himself talking about anti-war protests. But this is actually from, interesting enough, 1965. So this is, and by the way, when you watch this clip, pay very close attention to the groups Thurman is talking about, because in a way, this minute-and-a-half clip actually sums up our school pretty well. All right, let's roll the beautiful beam.
When is this from?
1965, from the Moving Images and Research Collection at the University of South Carolina.
And Becky's going to follow me and talk about what happened in '65 that Thurman was addressing right here at Columbia.
All right, so again, one of the key lessons you'll get out of tonight's class is that the anti-war movement had a considerable presence right here in Columbia, South Carolina.
Westmoreland's daughter was at the university when I was there, and she was not a fan of the war.
The several disobedience campaigns protesting United States involvement in Vietnam which erupted on the weekend of October the 16th in the most massive demonstrations to date, mark a sharp new success for the communists. It gives a clear signal that the communists are operating again through the popular front tactic which they first displayed in the United States in the early 1930s. The degree to which communists now operate in the open is evident from the remarks of Gus Hall, Secretary of the Communist Party USA, who recently bragged, and I quote, "Fronts are a thing of the past. We don't need them. We've got the W.E.B. Du Bois clubs, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Students for a Democratic Society going for us. But they are not fronts of the usual sense of the word. They are just a part of the responsible left, that portion of American youth that realizes American society is sick," end quote. Rigid enforcement of the laws can stem this tide, and it should be demanded by every responsible American.
But by the way, before we go on, can I just find the irony in him talking about enforcing the laws when that same year he's arguing against the Voting Rights Act? But okay, I'm just gonna sit down now. I
They don't understand communism.
please don't ever use that voice again.
Thank you, Dr. Greene. Yeah, and that Strom Thurmond was following in the footsteps of Jimmy Burns and figuring out that communism was a really good way to stop equality in America, because the black people here weren't smart enough to be doing this. It was a communist that was putting them up to it. They didn't know they was being screwed with it. Communists came up and told them that they weren't equal. And so that is a trope that they played out until that one got tired, and then we started blaming it on drug cartels, and then it was the war on terror, or then it was the Hispanics coming across the border. So there's always the other. It's always the other. It's not us. And so it becomes us when people like Strom Thurmond identify people in SDS in 1965 that were part of the problem of not supporting him. And that otherness we call now being woke. And I would tell you that it's very, very much a responsibility to be woke. I had the opportunity to become woke pretty early. I guess I can really attribute it to being raised that racism was a fool's game, and then being in South Carolina and segregated South Carolina and segregated schools, and it didn't make much sense. Living on Parris Island from 64 to 66, right during that run up to the Vietnam War, and realizing that my father had no idea why we were there. I remember having an argument with him about, well, Father, isn't what we're doing supporting French colonialism, the recolonization of Vietnam? Isn't that what we fought King George for? And I can't remember his answer, but it had nothing to do with the war. And so they then wanted me to go fight the war. I had 3 pre-induction physicals at Fort Jackson before they gave up on me and realized, we don't want to give that boy a gun. And that in 1965, it was the first really big protest at the Pentagon. And it was followed by other protests at the Pentagon. And we'll talk later, a little later, about lessons learned. But think about the way that America has painted its foreign ventures differently. I mean, we were first bringing civilization to the poor ignorant people, and then we were going to stop communism from taking over their country. And underneath it all, the people that don't realize that that is a disingenuous way of deflecting the fact that what we want is your resources and your cheap labor. And that it's real clear to me that, say, the people pick a nation, the people in Iran, when Kermit Roosevelt, a relative of, I think it was Teddy, was a CIA agent on the ground in Tehran, and Mossadegh was a socialist. Iran was the most secular and liberal entity in the Near East. And it threatened our ability to get our oil out from under their sand. And so Kermit single-handedly hired two groups to fight against each other, causing chaos in Tehran, giving the opportunity for the American government to facilitate a coup and bring in the Shah for a 20-plus year reign of terror. The Iranians remembered that. And now, it's like this business about the Arabs and they're being completely off the chain, and why would they want to have all these bombs and stuff? Well, it's because they remember you overthrowing their country. And you can go around the world pointing at those instances, whether it's Haiti, Nicaragua, Guatemala. And I was in, where was I? That was El Salvador. And sometime, I can't remember who was president, probably Reagan. But I was in a refugee camp in El Salvador. And there was this little naked kid about 2 years old clinging to my leg. And his parents had been killed by bombs we gave them. We're seeing that happen now in Gaza. Difference here, this is the takeaway, difference. You are not being drafted to go to Israel and fight the Palestinians. And so we don't have the millions of people in the streets that we had when they wanted me to go fight their bloody war. And that in I didn't come to main campus until 68. And it was a very, very trying year for those that were woke. And the Orangeburg Massacre was in February. Dr. King was killed in April. Bobby Kennedy was killed in June. And it just didn't seem to stop. And the Democratic National Convention was in 68. It's one of my big regrets. I missed Woodstock and the Democratic National Convention in the same year. Oh, and that opening by Country Joe. Country Joe was in the Navy for 3 years. And Country Joe started a rock and roll band to wake up people. And that was Woodstock with 1 million people. I saw Country Joe sing, and I think it was 1969, right after Nixon had been elected. And there was a protest with nearly 1 million people. It was one of the biggest. Country Joe's on the steps of the Capitol, and the crowd went all the way back to the Washington Monument. And there were 1 million people doing the fish cheer. The band was called Fish, and he spelled F-I-S-H differently than most of us do. But you had 1 million people chanting that word. And this is when Nixon was hiding behind the curtains in the White House, peeking out, because revolution was right around the corner. And what is so important, I think, in the through line here is that why was revolution right around the corner? And it was an age when colonialism was being combated all over the world. And Vietnam was just one element of that. After World War II, the colonization effort was confronted with a liberation struggle all over the world. And so there were people that were woke in this country that were supporting. I think there's some posters up here. The struggle in Angola and the struggle in Palestine and Vietnam and South Africa, all over the world. And the thing is, they're fighting for the same thing, but the American government is coming in and hiring puppets. In Vietnam, when Ho Chi Minh lost control, was when the United States went back in. Dr. Greene mentioned that Ho Chi Minh was working with the French to fight the Japanese. We see Ho Chi Minh had been working with the Viet Minh, which is the Vietnamese people that had been fighting the Japanese. Before they were fighting the Japanese, they were fighting China. And so when they were helping America, and they thought they were going to have allies to help them, and we went back in with the French. And so and the way that they do it is to pick someone that's going to defend democracy, to stop communism. And that didn't work out well. It has not worked out well. It continues to cause struggles all over the place. The circumstances of there's a list in your study guide of, I think it was 800 and something young men in South Carolina that died. And all of us knew someone that was over there, someone that was drafted, or someone that went to prison for refusing to go. And I was one of those that really wasn't really interested in going. And had an alternative pathway that we'll speak about in a minute. But I think that the main thing for us to understand here is that, one, being woke has a lot of responsibility, because you then become that front group that Thurman was warning people about in '65. And right now, the people that are woke about the situation as to what we're doing in Gaza, they've become the enemy. And the thing is that the people in Gaza, as well as the people all around the world, I was at a conference in the United Nations in 1983 on the second decennial conference on world racism at the United Nations. The first one was in '73, when the World Conference on Racism declared Zionism a form of racism. That if you have a Zionist government, that means you have a chosen people and everybody else is second-class citizens. And it was just like South Africa. And so when I went 10 years later, there were 3 countries that didn't participate: South Africa, because they were still apartheid; Israel, because they were the ones that were doing what it was that precipitated the characterization or the classification of Zionism as a form of racism; and their good friend and big brother, the United States of America. And out of 2,000 people from around the world, I was the only white male American there. And that's kind of the responsibility of being woke, that you find yourself in refugee camps and the United Nations meetings and in prison when you are doing that which it is that they told you they valued in this society. And I know that I have probably more to say, but I think that the emotive element of you understanding that being woke is a terrible responsibility, but it is one that will serve you all of your life for having a good reason for being on this planet, and not trying to step back from being woke, because we're the ones that are going to hopefully be able to see this experiment, this wonderful experiment of humanity on this tortured orb, go beyond global warming, go beyond war and pestilence, and profit at other people's misery. And so I'm going to turn this over to Becci Robbins, who many of you know is the communications director and the author of several of her books, and one of them is Generation No. And Becci took a really deep dive and spent a long time working on that book. And she kept finding things telling me, why didn't you tell me about this? And I was like, well, I guess the same reason Modjeska didn't tell me about the Southern Negro Youth Congress, or I didn't think about it. We lose our own history by not lifting it up. And that's what we're trying to do here today. And that's what the Modjeska School is about. It's because the history isn't just 150 or 200 or 500 years old. We're forgetting it as it happens. Becci?
Yes.
Take control of the screen now, okay? So you ready? You want to ask me questions? Or tell me to talk about something else.
Okay. Let me just start with Brett kind of went off script there. He was supposed to give a 10-minute history of Vietnam, and
did a good job.
not exactly what he delivered, but it was good. So now the book that he's talking about, the Generation No, I hope you all have had a chance to look at it. If you haven't, please do so when you have a chance. When I started, it was originally the book was supposed to be at about GROW, the grassroots organizing workshop that was operating for 10-20 years off of Bluff Road. I'm doing really important work, and I had the pleasure of being employed there for 10 years, working on an underground newspaper, or on an investigative newspaper called Point. And from the time that I started working there, I knew it was a very special place and always had intention of writing about it. And when one of my comrades, who also worked there, died in 2019, he left behind, he was a hoarder, and he left behind this fantastic archive of grassroots organizing in South Carolina going back forever, when they started printing things. And so he had this treasure trove of things that I started sifting through and cataloging and getting really excited about it. And so but I knew I wanted to put the GROW experience into place and time. So what was it that came before GROW to inspire these people to do the work that they did under really trying, impossible circumstances? So I started digging a little bit, and I started discovering that A lot of the people that started GROW were refugees from the anti-war movement and the environmental movement. So there was this crossover of of scholarship and activism that kind of converged at GROW. And it wasn't until I started digging a little further that I understood that South Carolina played this really pivotal role in the anti-war movement in ways that I had never heard of. I went to college at USC. I never heard about any anti-war activism going on there. And so when I started discovering putting these pieces together, I got really angry that I'd never learned any of these things, because I think they're so, on the one hand, just really instructive, and on the other hand, inspiring. And I guess that's probably the reason we don't know these things, because for me, it gave me a lot of hope that the power that one person can do. And one of those people that I was really inspired by was this young guy, a doctor from New York, who landed in South Carolina in 1965, the same year that Strom Thurmond clip that you just watched. So that was kind of the tone and tenor. The campuses were starting to heat up, and the streets were starting to heat up with anti-war activism, and they were doing teach-ins and marches, and so there was this young doctor in New York who was drafted, and he took advantage of what was called the Berry Plan, which was an opportunity for draftees to defer their service in the military until they completed medical school. And so that's what Dr. Levy did. But all the while that he was getting his education, he was going and getting educated and doing deep dives and reading and understanding, putting the stories together about what it was that he was about to be doing. And so when he landed at Fort Jackson in 1965, he was already really radicalized and very anti-war, but he had this obligation to fulfill with the Army. So for a while, he's a dermatologist, but he was there to train the troops that are headed off to Vietnam. At the time, Fort Jackson was the largest training base, and so a lot of the trainees were coming through Fort Jackson to do their training and then getting shipped off to Vietnam. And so he was there to train the troops, and did it reluctantly for a while, and then his conscience finally got the better of him, and he decided to stop training the troops. And he had already been ruffling feathers on the base, because he chose to live off base instead of living in officers' quarters. He didn't do his hair right. He didn't keep his uniform straight. And he was doing voter registration on his days off. He started a newsletter for voting rights in Black communities. The interesting thing that you might find is that he lived just a few blocks from where y'all are sitting at the GROW building. He lived on Marion Street, where he penned a letter. A friend of his asked him to write a letter to some guy that was a Black soldier serving in Vietnam. I'll just read you a couple sentences. He said, "Dear Jeffrey, my name is Howard Levy. I'm an Army dermatologist at Fort Jackson, and I've been reading your letters to Bill and have been especially interested in your views on Vietnam. Basically, there are two aims in our foreign policy. One, the stated part, to contain communism, and two, the unstated part, to support stable government so that our foreign investors may profit. It should be noted that our definition of communism is very, very broad, so broad, in fact, as to become practically worthless. You no doubt know more about the terror about whites have inflicted upon Negroes in our country. Aren't you guilty of the same thing with regard to the Vietnamese? A dead woman is a dead woman in Alabama and in Vietnam. To destroy a child's life in Vietnam equals a destroyed life in Harlem. And for what cause?" So this letter, it goes on. It's really kind of moving, to some guy in the field in Vietnam, challenging him on his views and trying to engage him the way they were all talking about it at the time. But that letter was used in court against Levy, who, of course, when he started refusing to train the troops, was hauled in by the company commander, who said, you either do your job or you face the consequences. And Levy decided that he would face the consequences, and they turned it out to be quite severe. There was a big trial. There he is. There he's a slight fellow for such a tiny guy. He really threw a big shadow and caused the brass a lot of angst and anxiety. And to me, what's so special about this is the power of one individual having the courage to stand up and do this, which was the first of its kind anywhere. You know, there were GI starting to talk and organize on the posts and stuff, but he was the first, along with the 3 folks from Fort Hood that ended up spending time with him in Leavenworth when he was finally. But the trial was a disaster. It was a fiasco. It was ridiculous. Charles Morgan, who had been the ACLU lawyer from Atlanta, who had done Muhammad Ali's case, which was pretty high profile, he took this case, and so it became this international story. And Levy was sentenced to 3 years at hard labor. And so when they hauled him off, the brass at Fort Jackson heaved this giant sigh of relief that their problems were over, because Levy was safely behind bars. And the truth was that their troubles were only just beginning. So just a few months after Levy was hauled off to jail, there was a pray-in at Fort Jackson that was organized in conjunction with the newly opened UFO Coffeehouse, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It was the first organizing effort that they did together, and the GI Coffeehouse was a civilian-run effort to support GIs at the fort. So the UFO did the media work, and that was decided that the event itself would be done by GIs in uniform. So in February, they about a couple dozen GIs organized a pray-in outside the chapel on the Fort Jackson. And the media was there because the UFO had alerted them, and the cops came because there was media there, and they ordered them to disperse. And most of them did. 5 guys hung around, and 2 of them fell to their knees and started praying. And MPs ordered them to get up, and they didn't. And so they ended up hauling them off to the stockade. It was a really bad move on their part. It's not a good look when you tell people to stop praying for peace and you haul them off to jail. And after a big, the Village Voice was there. There were people from all over. It was a national story, and they were getting embarrassed by these guys that had the audacity to pray for peace on the campus. So in 10 days, they realized that the Army realized the error of its ways, and they dropped charges. And that boosted the morale and the intensity of the GI organizing at the fort. So in 1968, there was a young draftee from DC who showed up at Company B on Fort Jackson. He was part of the Socialist Party, and he'd been doing anti-war work in DC. And when he showed up at Company B, he was really surprised to find this very robust and already bubbling anti-war sentiment that was taking hold and getting traction at the fort. And he started playing Malcolm X tapes that he'd brought with him. And there was a couple dozen guys. They were Blacks and Puerto Ricans at that point, and they were listening to these Malcolm X tapes and connecting the dots between American imperialism and racism, and started wondering about their role in the war. And they knew firsthand that Blacks and people of color and people that were poor were being drafted at higher rate, drafted and serving time serving in combat positions on the front lines in disproportionate numbers. So they started putting all of this together and getting organized. So they start meeting, and pretty soon they realize that they want to formalize what they're doing. So they decide they're going to give themselves a name. It's called GIs United Against the War in Vietnam. It's the first such group anywhere in the country. And they get serious real quick, or meeting 4 times 5 a week. The brass get wind of it, and they start thinking this is making them nervous. And so they issue a rule that you can't have gatherings of more than 8 soldiers at a time, because it's a risk to respiratory infection. So that does not deter the soldiers, who decide to, well, we'll just meet outside. So they meet between the barracks, even though it's January and it's cold out. And so they start meeting and talking in very serious ways about putting, why are they doing this? And is it worth the cost to them? And so they decide that it really is not. And so they start, their first organizing effort is to circulate petitions just for the chance to meet. They're trying to formalize the option for them to exercise their free speech rights, to organize and just have conversations. And so this is really testing the boundaries of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And I find out real quick that they pay a price for it. The brass refuses their petitions. They reprimand a bunch of people. They give them PT. They give them all. They really come down hard on these fees. Some of them face court-martial. But they continue to meet. They keep defying the rules. And at one point, there was this meeting in March. There were some 200 guys gathered between the barracks holding this meeting, and people hanging out the windows. And a couple drill sergeants come by and see what is happening and get a little freaked out. And they press charges against what they call the ringleaders, 9 soldiers initially, and they're called the Fort Jackson 9. It becomes this big trial again, this international story, because it's new. This is a new kind of uprising in the military within. It's not college kids. It's like guys wearing uniform, challenging their speech rights and their, everything. And so it causes a big kerfluffle. The thing finally goes to trial. These 9 guys are facing court-martial charges. And when the thing actually goes to trial, the thing falls apart. One of the guys charged turns out to have been a plant, and he had instigated the group to try to, take drugs and to instigate fights and things to try to get them to do things that they could come back and use against him. The good news that the guys on the inside knew that this was likely to happen. So they were very disciplined and didn't fall prey to any of that kind of bidding. So the trial itself made it look really sketchy for the Army. So they ended up dropping charges too. So the after that trial, the one thing that GIs United started, other than just being the first of its kind doing the organizing work, they also started one of the first and longest running GI newspapers, which was started on a mimeograph machine and then got more sophisticated over time. But it was all illegal and subversive, and it was a way for soldiers to kind of share information and to know what events were coming up, marches and stuff, and how to get conscientious objection, counseling, how they could get that, ways that they could fight back. And so it did a lot of good work, the GIs United, and it spread nationally. And at that time, in 1968, there was cross-pollination going on between what was happening on campuses and what was happening on military bases. And in 1968, Fred Gardner showed up in Columbia. He'd been an Army reservist, so he knew, and he had trained at Fort Jackson, so he knew the culture, he knew the city, he knew about Howard Levy, and he came to Colombia with this idea of opening up a coffee shop that would be civilian run, that would support the troops on the forts. And so he found this little place across from the City Hall on Main Street, directly across City Hall. And it was within walking distance of the bus depot, so that folks, the trainees could, get to it easily without without cars. Robert, could you play that video of Fred Gardner? It was clip 2.
Yes, it's coming right up.
Thanks.
Well, from my own experience in the service, I felt that it was important that GIs have a hangout, a place they could gather in a non-military atmosphere and discuss the things that were really on their mind.
Did you sell any alcoholic beverages there?
No, we didn't. It was a coffee house.
Did you have any trouble with drug pushers or users?
On occasion, they tried to operate out of the UFO. We expelled them, and we made an offer to the police, not if we wouldn't finger anybody, but if they would supply us with names and pictures of people they knew to be pushers, we would talk to them at the door and try and keep them out on, using our own methods.
Did you form it basically because you're opposed to the war in Vietnam and wish to influence soldiers?
For both moral and tactical grounds, I never tried to influence soldiers. I always had the feeling that if and when men got a sense of their true numbers and realized how many hundreds, how many thousands of them were choking with shame and angry and unwilling to go to Vietnam, they would find ways of expressing their own feelings.
So, as a place for a GI to hang out.
What's wrong with Bob Hope and Martha Ray and ping pong? Nothing. It's just that people, there's another culture in this country.
Yeah, there really was another culture in the country, and they were about to find out. So the UFO was so successful right off the start that Fred Gardner left after just a couple of months to open up some more coffee houses in Killeen, Texas, and in Washington, outside of military installations. And before long, there were coffee houses all over the country and overseas as well. It was such a powerful tool, and it became an organizing model, a new organizing model that integrated soldiers' interests with folks that are being drafted on campuses, and it was a really powerful thing. At one point, Westmoreland said a private memo to LBJ saying, well, with these coffee houses at this point, we don't see them as a huge threat, so we don't want to interfere at this point. But nobody got the message in Colombia, because they started cracking down on the UFO in a very serious way. Almost immediately, the FBI and local cops started infiltrating the UFO and trying to get dirt on them. And when they couldn't get dirt, they tried to plant dirt. It was a very seamy and intense campaign. And we know about this because we now have access to the FBI records, and they are frankly chilling. The lengths and depths of the infiltration at that UFO is just over the top, and the amount of energy that they put into that is really kind of shocking. But I guess that really shows the level of threat that they thought they posed. So eventually it worked. They ended up coming in two years after the place had opened, arresting 5 of the staff members. Well, charging 5 of the staff members with a public nuisance. One of them evaded capture and went to New York. One of them was a woman who, by the time they were going to go to trial, would have been 8 months pregnant, and they decided that wasn't a really good look. So they dropped charges against her, even though she fought to be tried along with them, and they said no. So they dropped charges against her. And so there were these three guys that were facing charges for running the UFO. And they went to trial. It was an ugly, ugly, comical thing that you can read about in the book. It some of it was it's funny because it was so over the top and ridiculous. But could you Robert, play 3 and 4 clips? It ignited this wave of support on campus and in Columbia for the defendants because it was seen as ridiculous.
While Robert's pulling that up, after they arrested the people, they chained the door shut and we couldn't get in, and they left food in the refrigerator and all of that. It was just, they were just
Rude.
fellow with the headband was my FBI undercover guy. That's Will Balk from Blackville that had his fist up. And Dwayne Frey on the right there, he was in Air Force, served time in the Air Force, and the person in the middle, that's Lenny Cohen. And they were all employed at the coffee house.
I'll show them. Just one second.
What was the name of that thing? UFO Coffee? So what was the name of the clip?
The name of what?
The clip you watched?
That's is Moving Image Resource Center, MIRC, at the University of South Carolina. They've aggregated all kind of interesting things from the, those are news clips.
Now, the one you just watched was showing some of the defendants in the trial being brought to Richland County Courthouse. And this one is a clip of a march and rally protest the closing of the UFO coffee shop. And this is from 1970. Yeah, 1970.
Yeah, so you can see that it really lit a fire under certain elements in Colombia. And they did go to trial. The defendants ended up being given 6 years in prison. They appealed, but the case kept dragging on, and they decided to finally take a deal. And in exchange for having the charges dropped, they left the state, which is a recurring theme, and why that we're still struggling in South Carolina, because they keep draining the best and brightest and the uppity folks out of here. So that's your job, to replenish that pool, my friends. And I'm gonna turn it over to Brett, because what happened after the UFO trial, it kind of, not kind of, it totally lit on fire the already simmering unrest that was happening on campus at USC. There'd already, as Brett will tell you, there'd been groups organizing, but this really was a catalyst for setting them in motion and lighting the campus on fire in May of 1970, which had a couple weeks of severe violence and police looting, not police looting, police conflicts, we shall say, that they were going into dorms and throwing rocket grenade. It was really hairy and very intense, and it went on for a long time. It ended with a bunch of arrests of students and disrupted the whole graduation end of semester for a lot of seniors, and quite a scene. And Brett was there, so he can tell you about it.
What Brett remembers, he will share. I want to back up a little bit and speak to the guy that was next to Howard Levy when they were bringing.
Wait, Brett, I'm sorry. I think this is important because I'm sorry. There was one more clip I really wanted to play first, because this is Will Balk, Robert, the last one of him. This is Will Balk after the trial and how deflated and demoralized he was. And I think it speaks to the way that a lot of folks were feeling at that time.
People that were raised well getting woke. Will Balk.
I have serious doubts about whether I'll be able to respect, as Judge Agnew commended all three of us, respect law and order. We were commended, as we were brought before the bench, we were commended for having behaved ourselves well in the courtroom. It was with a great deal of naivete that I went into that courtroom. I really did respect the courts. I did have hopes. I did think that justice would be served. I did think that people would be able to see the facts and be able to judge fairly. I did think that the solicitor and the judge, even with their prejudices, would be able to act fairly and according to law. That's impossible for me to believe now. There is no way for anyone to convince me that the court that I sat in was a fair judicial situation. There's no way for me to believe that that served law and order.
In other words, you don't think that you received a fair trial?
I believe that under the system, that probably was a fair trial.
What passed for fair trials at the time was really bad theater. I mean, I've been in some really bad movies with the same solicitor that prosecuted the UFO people. But those were the times. I mean, I don't think that I don't think that they've substantively changed. I mean, we now have a Supreme Court that's completely a bad movie. And so we still have our work to do. But I wanted to point out that the guy walking next to Howard Levy at the time, Charles Morgan, he is somebody that isn't given enough applause. He's passed now. But Morgan was the one that filed the first case in the late 1960s. It was either late 50s or right at the beginning of 1960s, suing over the fact that one person, one vote wasn't happening in South Carolina. And that the one person, one vote thing was predicated on the Constitution of 1895, where they appointed one senator per county, regardless of how many people were in that county. And that type of thing that grew out of Jim Crow. The white senators control the state. They devolved the power down from the executive. So there were more black people than white people. So the black people couldn't take the executive offices like governor. And in 71, the Reynolds v. Sims was the case. And they said, well, no, we've got to reorganize stuff. And that was the time when home rule was passed to try and comply with the Supreme Court ruling. And prior to that, it's still struggling to implement itself. The senators appointed all the county councils and all the city councils and set their budgets. You see the cartoons about Boss Hogg, the white Southern senator? It's true. And they ran the whole show. And so it was pretty much that way in this. Well, I mean, definitely was that way in the 60s. And this is where we are now, is in the 60s, that the law was what they said the law was. And they dressed it up a little bit, but it's still kind of rough out there, folks. But Charles Morgan, he did that. And then we see the Levy case in 65. In 68, he was doing Julian Bond's case because Julian Bond won a seat in the House of Representatives in Georgia, and they wouldn't seat him because it was against war in Vietnam. And Charles Morgan took that case and won. He was Muhammad Ali's lawyer when Muhammad Ali refused to go to be drafted, and he won that case. And he helped me in the Supreme Court, and I lost. But that's another story. But he's somebody that certainly I have a responsibility for lifting him up because he kind of got swept off the pages here. But I wanted to talk about what happened in that juncture between the military guys and the students at that time. That there wasn't much difference in the age of the trainees. And when Becci was talking about the UFO, you have to get in your head that the bus station she's talking about was just 2 blocks away on Blanding, I think it is. Cool bus station. And that they would bring the guys in, thousands of them, by bus and dump them. And here they are wandering around. And so it was a real opportunity to have a place where these people could go. So it's not something that the place didn't just sit there empty waiting for people to come. There were these guys kind of checking it out. What's the first, if you want to make people go somewhere, you tell them they can't go there. And so everybody wants to go see what's happening. And it was a vibrant place. And I spent a lot of time there and worked with I ran the mimeograph machine for short times and helped them do their papers. And we were a rather confrontational lot at the time. I was banned from Fort Jackson for this green car pulled up in front of my house on Devine Street one day, and this lieutenant got out and came up and banged on the door and said, "Know ye by all men's presence, the commanding general of Fort Jackson has found you inimical to the conduct, morale, and discipline of his troops, and you are banned from the fort." Period. Boom. Okay, cool. I was helping people get out and run to Canada and stuff like that they found attacking. But that sense of camaraderie, that we were fighting the same enemy, we were dealing with them differently, that's something that we certainly don't see that much of right now. I mean, the people that are opposing what's going on in Gaza aren't confronting that because America's dealing with that differently, so that's something they learned. Challenging the hypocrisy that we're raised with is a really important thing in life. And I've been saying now for a good while that we're in a post-hypocrisy era where we used to, even during these times here, the people that were in charge would say we're not doing this, we believe in that, and we don't believe in racism and et cetera. Now we've got this guy who may be the next president who's just straight up admitting that he's a white Christian nationalist fascist. And so that they used to make it up and now they're not. So maybe that's moving forward in some sense of progress where it heightens the contradiction. I think that was something, heighten the contradiction is a term that I can't remember where it came from. Y'all look that up. But it's one that we always talked about in the organizing, I guess all my life, that contradiction of saying that red, yellow, black, white, depression side, or that contradiction of saying equality is, we're all equal. If you heighten the contradiction between what they say and what they do, you can wake people up. And so the contradiction is through the roof, and it's a wonderful time for organizing. It's a wonderful time for challenging the people that aren't challenging the heightened hypocrisy that has dropped the pretext of the values that we would expect leadership to hold. Mm-hmm. And this is a really challenging time, but there's an old saying, the Chinese saying about the other side of the coin of crisis is opportunity. And it's scary, but that's true. When the closing of the UFO precipitated a UFO in exile being held in the Russell House. And that precipitated the university saying that, you have to be a student to come on campus and passing all kind of rules and laws and all. That would have been in '69. And that I was the co-chair of the radical group on campus that had been kind of died out after the students that had started it in '65 called AWARE. And it wasn't an acronym, it was AWARE. And that I came in fall of '68. I'd been in University of Georgia for my freshman year, where I got involved with the Southern Student Organizing Committee, which was formed when the white people left SNCC, the Student Non-Organizing Committee in '64. And it was a Southern SDS. There was a deal cut between the people that started SDS and SOC, with it. SOC can have the South because we don't know how to deal with it. And it's true. I mean, it's a basic rule of organizing, grassroots organizing, or guerrilla warfare. You damn well better know the natives. You better be able to speak like the natives, or they're not going to hide you when you come running down from the mountains. And so the work that we were doing at the University of South Carolina in '68 and '69 and '70 was radical anti-imperialist work that many of us had learned from the civil rights movement. I mean, I had got involved in the civil rights movement simply by paying attention to the racism that was all around me in Beaufort, South Carolina, growing up. And then at University of Georgia, the fraternities bragged about not having people of color, and they didn't call them people of color. And the KAs had festooned, KAs was the big ones, and it was festooned with Confederate flags. But in 1968, in November 1968, this guy from Atlanta named Lester Maddox ran for governor. And Lester closed his restaurant because the Civil Rights Act. And y'all, if you don't know who Maurice is, the saying here was, y'all know Maurice, because everybody knew Maurice. And Maurice Messenger was the Lester Maddox of South Carolina. And Maurice was a stone cold racist, and he ran for president as a stone cold racist and didn't get far. But Lester Maddox ran for governor, and he was a cartoon. He had an 8th grade education. He literally held up a matchbook one time during a TV debate with Bo Calloway, who'd been like Secretary of the Navy at the time, and his family, wealthy, bourbon rulers in Georgia, and that the matchbook was where he got his high school degree from. I have a high school degree. I got it from this place right here, he said. And I remember being at University of Georgia watching debates with Maddox and Calloway when the issue was the problem with prisons. They were having riots in the prisons. And Lester's suggestion was, we need a better class of prisoners, to which we all agreed with. They were arresting the wrong people. But he won. He won the governor's race. And that was one of my first march for the Southern Student Organizing Committee. That was in 66, that was, November 66. And at Lester, there's Lester. And Lester sold axe handles that were used to beat people of color with. And I remember, I think I got one that was a little hatchet handle. So for the little people to beat little people with, I guess. But this is, remember now, segregation was legal. So in 1930, we moved real quickly past my good friend Smedley Butler, who's been a hero of mine, another guy that needs to be lifted up. 1932, Butler was with the Bonus Army. Y'all remember talking about the Bonus Army, the GIs that got screwed from World War I? He's preaching to them. At the same time, there's this thing that's been referred to as the business coup. And it was literally, they being the people that felt that Roosevelt and his New Deal was socialism, there was going to be a coup in this country. And you remember seeing Nazi-Town, USA, same year, thousands of people in Madison Square Garden, nice white guys in hats and suits doing the Sieg Heil. It almost happened here. And so don't think it can't happen again here. And so part of what we need to be doing is this beloved community that knows how to help each other and keep our values alive. There's no time in your life that you would have more sense of vitality than actually believing in what you're doing and being challenged for doing it. It brings out the best in people. So back to 1969, the university was at a rather high peak at the time because of the things that were happening. This was a time when the women had to be in at 10 o'clock and they had to wear dresses, they couldn't wear pants and all that type of stuff. And so there was that going on in local parentis and little parents as the university. And I was the co-chair of the AWARE group on campus. And my other co-chair was a graduate student of sociology named Jack Weatherford. And we were doing educational work using the Southern Student Organizing Committee little booklets about racism. SOC was a civil rights organization that only started in '64, and by '65 and '66, it's becoming an anti-war organization, with the understanding that that what we were doing in Vietnam was racist. I mean, it's not an accident that the countries that we go in and save from communism happen to be, black or brown. And that it was the tin, the magnesium, the bananas, and et cetera, that the French were exploiting out of Vietnam for 80 years that looked really attractive to the people in this country that wanted to exploit tin, magnesium, and bananas. And so that sense of internationalism in terms of our commitment to equality was completely opposed to, or in opposition to, the government's foreign policy, which was using force to stop the dominoes from falling. And so that was also happening in microcosms when we had the killings in Orangeburg in 1968. And the killing of Martin Luther King. I was in Columbia after King died, and there were active duty military vehicles, Jeeps with 50 caliber machine guns all over town. And they killed the 3 people in Orangeburg and wounded 28. And nobody ever got in trouble for that. Nobody ever got in trouble for that. Cleve Sellers spent some time in jail for it. Has been blamed as the outside organizer. He's actually from Montgomery County. And that only, 2 years, that was 68, 69, 70. By 70, when the things are heating up at the university, was back up to 69. 69, Nixon came to town for Jimmy Burns' 92nd birthday. And we had organized a protest at the airport. And the people that were the hospital strikers from Charleston, they came up en masse. And we were there from the university, had a meeting like the day before Nixon came to town. And he had not been in office very long at all, because I think it was early '69. And they wouldn't let the people that were protesting the war in Vietnam into the area at the airport where people were holding up signs about, bomb them back to the Stone Age and supporting Nixon. And there was a bit of a confrontation. And I remember having a very short debate with the sheriff about the fact that we have free speech rights and you can't do this. And then they beat us up and put us and arrested 11 people. And I woke up in solitary confinement after 3 days. And what's the hole? I didn't know they had one. And it was a steel room with a hole in the bottom of it with nothing. No lights, no bed, no nothing. And it was my first psychedelic experience. It was really enlightening, because try that. Go lock yourself in a room for 3 days. And you get uncomfortable and you can't even tell whether you're asleep or awake. And I come out and find I've been charged with felonious assault to a police officer, 20 years in prison. And the police officer then grew up to be Jimmy Metz, the sheriff of Lexington, who later I was arrested at the same place, did the same thing with a different president 20-something years later. But the level of slap down oppression was just amazing. And that in '69, it turned over into '70, and it was, I guess it was what precipitated the big hoo-ha of the early '70s was the invasion of Cambodia, or the bombing of Cambodia. It was like bringing in another front, which I think, in my estimation, is analogous to going into Iraq and dropping bombs on civilians. But there were 360 plus universities and literally millions of students that shut down campuses all over America. And this was in early May, I think, and then by May 4th was Kent State, where they killed the kids in Kent State. And then the thing started out at the university. I can't remember what day it was, Dr. Greene, the days of May. There's a little booklet the university put out with there was 7 or 8 days of May. But after Kent State, we had already had, before Kent State happened, the Russell House, or Ware had reserved the Russell House to have a teach-in, because we're going to have a strike. And the night before that, we made wheat pasted posters up that said strike. I don't know if these strike posters. And some of them were like strike because there's cops in Russell House, strike because of this, strike because there's that. And so I just said strike. And the front of Thomas Cooper Library was covered with them. They were everywhere. And so it was an event. And then I was already banned from campus by then by court order. I had been suspended because I violated campus rules and like put up signs without getting the right stamp on them. And it moved furniture without asking permission. And that's a poster that I helped silkscreen. And I still have one of those. But the day of what was going to be the teach-ins, they told us we couldn't go to the Russell House. They told the students they couldn't go to the Russell House. I was already banned from campus by court order because I had been arrested in March for spray painting "Hell No, We Won't Go on the Draft Board Wall" with my co-defendant, Jack Weatherford. We were the co-chairs of the AWARE group. And I think it was before I was kicked off campus and then had a court order against me. Jack and I were called to a student affairs committee meeting in the Russell House to defend AWARE's charter as an approved organization, because we had put up posters without a stamp on them. We had moved tables and chairs to have meetings, and the doors flew open and its sled came in and threw the co-chairs up against the wall and arrested both of us because the night before we had vandalized the local draft board. And so AWARE ceased to exist at that point. And it did seem kind of fishy that was all kind of like coordinated so nicely. But that was in March, and then here we are in May. And I'm banned by a portion of the city that was bounded on one side by Sumter and the other side by Pickens and Blossom and I think Pendleton. So it's a square block around the university. And so I'm standing in front of Longstreet Theater with a walkie-talkie talking to people in the Russell House, and they thought I was involved in some way. But there were 41 people that refused to leave. And they brought in, these guys here were the ones that had just killed the people in Orangeburg. And there was a requirement to be very large with an IQ that matched the number of teeth you had in your head. These were huge, mean people. And the ground, there were high patrol cars all the way from Greene Street all the way to Pickens Street lined up. And the ground was littered with empty boxes of buckshot. They had loaded their pump shotguns with buckshot, which is what you use to kill large mammals. And that you have the picture in the Russell House with Pete Strom hovering over the students. I'm not sure we have that one. But they told the students leave or be arrested, and the 41 of them refused to leave. The picture on the cover there of Becci's book, which you have or should have, that's the head of the state police, who is our little J. Edgar Hoover. And the picture on that book is when they were pushing people back, and that picture is Becky Hardy, who was one of our activists. They were pushing people back because they had gathered around the big green bus that they pulled up right in front of the Russell House to take the rest of the people out, and they couldn't get the bus out. And what was really revelatory was there were maybe 300 anti-war people on campus, and we had the meeting the night before, went out and protested Nixon and whatnot. But that when they brought the Guard in, they brought the National Guard and the city police in to push the people out and get the bus out. There were thousands of students cheering the Guard. They got the people out, and Pete Strom, the guy with the helmet on, he was in front of the Green Street, and I could see them jumping up and down and pointing at me, and I'm standing in front of Long Street, which is at the end of that long block. And the chief waddled up all the way, and he came up to me, and he looked at me, and I swear to God, he said, "That's what you had." I'm moving. He thumped me on the chest. He says, "Boy, you're in a heap of trouble. We're gonna make an example out of you. You're under arrest." And they put me in the back of a paddy wagon, and Vicki Esslinger, she's a lawyer here in town now, but she remembers this a little differently than I do. But I remember her beating on Pete's chest as they're driving me off in this Ford, because she had come to take me to meet with Michael Mungo, who was chairman of the board of trustees. And so there's this milieu of people that were the liberals that believed we were doing it right, but they didn't want to get too close to it. That's the difference between a liberal and a radical. A radical's got the strength of their convictions, and the liberals just kind of wish you well and help you pay your bond. They took me to jail again, and there were no charges because he arrested me for violating the conditions of my bond. But you can't do that. A judge has to do that. So a couple days later, they let me out, and I had the benefit of having a wonderful alibi when the administration building was trashed the next day, because I was in jail. I didn't do it.
Is that you?
Oh, yes. That was right after the chief thumped me in the chest and said, "Boy, we're gonna make an example out of you." The guy on the left I've known for, a long time now. Ron Cook was an MP at Fort Jackson that ran me off the base. And then he went to work for SLED. And he was my above cover guy for a year or more. And I'll get to Jack Weatherford in a minute. But he was the guy that when the people came from the Rolling Stone to see what was happening, and I would meet them, and I would have them in my car, and the high patrol light would come on behind us. And it was a routine license check, everybody out of the car. And here's this guy leaning against the black Ford one, car behind, grinning, because they just wanted to know, they wanted to keep in touch with people. And we figured our house was bugged, and we paid a detective to come, and he found they'd gone under the house and drilled up into the wall and put stuff in there. And we said, "Well, you take it out." He says, "No, they'll hire me again to come put something in that you won't find." And it's like, you just accept that everything you say is on record. And so there's that level of penetration of our lives that actually went all the way to the Supreme Court. I'm going to jump ahead with a little sidebar here. That the case when I was arrested for doing the draft board thing, it turned out most of my friends were paid to be my friends. I thought I was popular.
What?
But Jack Weatherford was a co-chair of this group with me. And his long hair and I were short haired, and we introduced him to a woman that he was living with, and that he met with my attorney and I while we're planning this case. The arrest was in March, the trial was in August, and the same courtroom that had the UFO trial in, with the same buffoon that was the prosecutor. And they called the first witness for the prosecution Jack Weatherford, my co-defendant, who the night before had been urging me to flee. He said, "They're gonna fry you. They're gonna fry you." And he'd been meeting with me and my lawyer all this time. And the first question was, "Mr. Weatherford, how long have you been an agent for the State Law Enforcement Division?" He said, "About a year and a half." "And what was your job at SLED?" "To watch Mr. Bursey." If my mind had not been blown, I would have laughed out loud, because you spent a year and a half and you caught me spray painting held my wheel on the draft board wall. I mean, what a waste of your time and money. And that I was convicted of malicious mischief. I just remember the UFO people got convicted of keeping and maintaining a public nuisance. Nobody had ever gone to jail for that before. And it wasn't very likely to go to jail for malicious mischief. But I got sentenced to a year and a half, and they were laughing about that, because a year and a half, you don't get any good time. You have to serve the whole thing out, and ended up serving nearly 2 years in prison. But that case went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Charles Morgan was one of the lawyers that helped, and Lachlan McDonald from Winsboro had taken his place in Atlanta running the ACLU. And I had the wonderful opportunity to appear in person in the U.S. Supreme Court and have Thurgood Marshall and Justice Brennan take my side. And so I can say I had Thurgood Marshall for the lawyer. And that I lost big time. The other 7 people, said, "The Constitution does not entitle you to private counsel, only adequate counsel, and you have to prove how the mere presence of an agent in the defense camp deprives you of adequate counsel," which I don't think you can figure out even how you could prove what they learned they used against you or not. So I ended up serving some time in jail and getting a lot smarter. And I see Dr. Greene's ready to jump to his feet, so we have some questions.
I'm actually gonna recharge my laptop. Please keep going. I mean,
No,
we're at
no.
8:16, so we'll take questions.
Becky, give me that finger across the throat sign.
No, yeah. We wanted some time for questions, and we're really running out of time, but I really did want to, because part of what we wanted to talk about was what did we learn from all of this and what did we not learn? And I wanted to play this clip that's from a movie that came out in 2005. It's about 4 minutes, and it's about, how quickly the war was rewritten. as soon as the troops left Saigon, they're already rewriting history. And this is kind of making that point. Dr. Greene, do you have that clip?
Yes.
Thank you.
We poll the audience here and Zoom land and say, would y'all stay a few minutes extra? If we run over a little bit here, because this is like home movies here. This is why.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll stay.
All the stories you tell me, I'll stay home.
All right, about to play the clip now from Sir, No Sir.
The war.
The Vietnam War ended on April 30th, 1975, as North Vietnamese and National Liberation Front troops entered Saigon. And even as the last remaining Americans were returning home, the memory and reality of the GI anti-war movement was being rewritten.
Yeah, they love everybody back there. Cats, dogs, niggers, spicks. And they're real fond of Luke the Gook back home. Y'all can believe that. They love everybody but you.
The typical story of a spat upon vet is arriving at the San Francisco airport and where he's met by demonstrators. And he says, the first thing that happened when I got off the plane in San Francisco, a girl in love beads and a headband spat in my face and called me a baby killer. That version of the story has been told over and over and over again. Being a Vietnam vet and having come home and worked with the anti-war movement, these just didn't resonate as true to me. So I began to get interested in then where did these stories come from and how long had they been around, who had begun telling them. I went back to the point in time, the late 60s, early 1970s, to see whether there's any reports in newspaper stories that activists were spitting on Vietnam vets. No, I didn't find anything. I looked at some National Lawyers Guild observation projects of demonstrations to see whether there's anything in their archives about this. No, nothing there. Were any Vietnam vets claiming that they were being spat on? Were any pro-war people then claiming that Vietnam vets were being spat on? No. So I thought, well, now this is getting really interesting. I was telling a friend of mine who's a psychologist, she also teaches in women's studies, and I was telling her that I was working on a book about Vietnam vets having been spat on. And she said, well, that's really interesting. She said, who supposedly had done the spitting? I said, what do you mean? She said, well, the demographics of the spitters. And I said, well, young women, protesters, hippies. And she broke out in this big smile, and she says, gotta be a myth, huh? And I knew what was coming next. I knew what she was going to say next, which is that girls don't spit. Now, whether girls spit or not, I've had some other conversations about that, but it seems pretty unlikely that these spitting incidents occurred. A lot of these stories, again, begin with, well, we arrived at the San Francisco airport. No, you didn't arrive at the San Francisco airport. Nobody did. You maybe arrived at Travis Air Base near San Francisco, and then you were discharged or you were processed out, and then you went to the San Francisco airport. That's possible, but that's not the way the stories are told. We were met on the tarmac at San Francisco airport. Too many guys that got off at the San Francisco airport. Somebody's making something up here, and certainly if it was at military, Air Force bases, there couldn't have been protesters on the base, much less on the tarmac or at gate side to meet people. There are stories.
Becky, you've got other circumstances where there are tropes about certain movements. Speak to those.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing happened. They show a clip later in that thing from Rambo where he makes the case, like that was a big movie, making the case, I came back from the war and the people spitting at me and calling me a baby killer and all that. Well, so it really became part of the American imagination in a very real and deep way. And that's why if you will ask anybody on the street what they remember about Vietnam, I bet you if it doesn't come to spitting, it will certainly be about how the vets were treated when they got home. But I think that it's kind of analogous to this whole notion about the feminist movement in the 70s reduced to bra burners, and that never happened either. So it was like the women did like there was this big protest that the feminists did in the 70s at some, I don't know, it might have been the Democratic, some big event, and they decided to protest, and they had a trash bin outside that people were supposed to throw in their symbols of the patriarchy. So people throwing in their lipsticks and their high heels, and somebody threw their bra in there. And so that became like women burning their bras, and it becomes this thing that takes on a life of its own, but it gets traction, and it's so frustrating to get people to think a little deeper and a little broader. I just thought the whole spitting thing is so emblematic of the war, and unfortunately so. So I think we need to reclaim the narrative, make sure that people understand what really happened. And one way to do this is to go to the Vietnam War exhibit that's at the State Museum. It started it was supposed to close last spring, but they've kept it open because it's really boosted attendance at the museum. But I'll tell you one thing, I went last year to go see what they were talking about, and it's a really slick exhibit that I encourage you to go look at. But I want to tell you that not a single thing that we have talked about, not a peep about a single thing we've talked about tonight, about the GIs at Fort Jackson, the things that happened at USC, none of it made it into the exhibit, not a bit. And I think that it's worth us kind of pushing back a little bit on that. So thanks for letting us go long.
Any questions from the audience? Please go right ahead.
You're gonna have to forgive me. I was taught that we won Vietnam, so these are probably not.
That is true. We were taught that.
What did we win?
Child,
I was
everything.
I was
not
taught that.
Yeah, I wasn't taught that either.
Vietnam was never on any syllabus that I've ever experienced in public education, but I was told that we won, and that was like the day that was anyway. I know very little about this.
I'm gonna second that. I was told in school that we won Vietnam.
Yeah.
As ridiculous as
I
that.
found out we lost like a year ago.
And I asked the same question, what did we win?
Yeah.
And
The people that write history are the winners. And we don't write the history.
Right.
Right. And so somebody wrote that history that wasn't telling the truth.
I will say too, as someone who went to elementary, middle school in the 1990s, I was part of that first generation that learned about Vietnam in retrospect. And the way it was taught to us was either it wasn't mentioned in class at all, or if we did learn about it, it was you got into Vietnam for these really complicated reasons. There was the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, and then the argument was always, well, we fought the best we could, but morale at home plummeted, and then we pulled the troops back home, and that was it. And so there was very little, there was mention of the anti-war movement, but it was often put in terms of, yeah, there was an anti-war movement, but nobody really liked them anyway. And that was kind of how it was really kind of situated back in the 1990s. And the spitting thing too, right, that they mentioned in the video of protesters spitting on returning soldiers, that was something I constantly heard growing up. And it wasn't until I got to graduate school and I read, not that book, but another book about anti-war resistance to Vietnam, where they point out, oh, by the way, there were no actual confirmed incidents of spitting on soldiers in the media, period. It was just a myth that kind of became fact, basically. Yes.
Hold on, Lauren, that was just a comment. Lauren didn't get the question yet.
So I was wondering, like, what was the goal of the war? Like, what were we trying to make Vietnam into? Something more like what PR is right now? Like,
well, that question is answered by how we got there. And see, after World War II, Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese had been fighting the Japanese and were our buddies. And everybody that was paying attention figured, well, they're going to get their country back for the first time in centuries. Because they've had the Japanese were there for 80, the French were there for 80 years, the Japanese come in, before that was the Chinese. And so we went in, US went in, put troops on the ground. My father I was in the Military Assistance Advisory Group in Taiwan in 1954. See, the Diem de Feu when the French fell was 52. And so this was right at that cusp when we're sending advisors in to help the French recolonize. And so our interest in going in was maintaining the colonial access to the wealth of those people. Explained by fighting communism, because if Vietnam fell to communists, then Laos would be next and Cambodia, et cetera, we lose those markets. But they don't talk about markets, they talk about freedom and democracy and blah, blah, blah.
In terms of what South Vietnam would turn into, and again, this is the domino theory that we talked about earlier. You also want to keep in mind that by the 60s, we already had examples of American allies in Asia that were not communist, but also not like democratic. Most notably South Korea, which at that point was still a dictatorship, and also Taiwan, which was, you know, the nationalists lose Chinese Civil War in 1949. Chiang Kai-shek was forced to flee to Taiwan and set up a Chinese government basically in exile. And for decades in the UN, the United States recognized Taiwan as China and not the People's Republic of China on the mainland as the actual legitimate government of China. But in terms of what we're trying to do, it was really, as Brett pointed out, number one, maintain access to markets in Asia. Number two, to stop the spread of communism and to prevent what we refer to as domino theory. But then I guess number three was basically, we'll stop communism somehow. And
we spend more money, Americans do, on military hardware than all the other countries put together. And that we just went ahead and sent another millions and millions of dollars of bombs to Israel. This is an incredible business. You know, you make somebody a washing machine, they might keep for 20 years. You sell them a bomb, sell them another one the next day, the next day, the next day. So war is really good business, unless you invest your son in it and he dies.
all right, any other questions in the room? Yes, go ahead.
I had a comment and then a question. So the comment is just as you were saying, Brett, like, do we not realize that basically what we're funding is just keeping Jim Crow alive? Because like what the country of Israel right now represents is not democracy.
Well, I probably have a consensus in this room that
Right.
we're doing that.
Yeah,
But you're watching what's happening in Congress and in the legislature here.
yeah, just like the realization that like what happens there, like the whole nation state law is saying that only Jewish people have the right of self-determination, nobody else. And the opposite of having one country or two countries or whatever with equal rights for everybody means Jewish people, Palestinian people, everybody gets the right to, you know, one person, one vote. So that's kind of like reframing what we are actually supporting and finding. But my question was going to be, is part of the problem now the fact that like we've never had accountability for what the United States did in Iraq or Afghanistan, like just the I think last week the Abu Ghraib trial was declared a mistrial, that like the people who were like very obviously tortured by contractors, like just the lack of accountability, could that have something to do with?
So yeah, but that's I think one of the most important takeaways of the Modjeska School is that this country was set up for the maintenance and control of the people that were benefiting from it. Who made the rules? I think that the government, the documents that the government set up, the founding fathers, were aspirational. It's the governance that's the problem. This two-party system, we're the only advanced industrial democracy in the world that lets the winners, who don't even have to get the popular vote, make all the decisions. In South Carolina, we're now down to just this fraction of people voting, and they get to make all the rules. So this two-party system, Washington warned us against the party, and the from whence it all cometh is corporate money. And Jefferson warned us about corporations. And so that therein lies the original sin of this nation being designed to suppress people and take advantage of them. And we're the originalists, and so we're the patriots. So that we really need to claim that. And we're not the ones living in some kind of painful, delusional, hypocritical lifestyle where you say you believe something, but you don't act on it. So that's your challenge, my dear, and you're a dangerous woman.
Well, and to add to Brett's point, you've probably seen, I think in the last week or last couple of weeks, last month or so that South Africa, amongst other nations, has tried to take Israel to the International Criminal Court on the accusation that Israel has fomented a genocide against the Palestinian people. It is worth noting that the International Criminal Court has never actually indicted anybody from a Western nation, either Western Europe or North America or Israel. And also the International Criminal Court is not formally backed by the United States either. We're not actually a participant in it. In fact, Congress passed a law back in the 2000s under the Bush administration that said if the International Criminal Court tried to indict any Americans, we have the right to send soldiers into it to dissolve said court. But
no questions.
There is a question in the chat from Cecil. He asked it back at 8 o'clock, so I want to get to it. He said, Dr. Greene, President Taft led with a dollar diplomacy policy to give clout to U.S. imperialism. Can you briefly trace that to the present in its incarnation, having influence over policy as K Street? And K Street, of course, is a reference used for some of the lobbying firms that are quite powerful in Washington, D.C. To make a very long story short, what you see in the early 20th century, especially under the administrations of Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Taft and going forward, is this growing nexus or consolidation of U.S. foreign policy with business policy or business interest. There was a saying from the early 20th century that, you know, what's good for U.S. steel is good for America, that sort of thing. But what you see with K Street in the 20th and 21st centuries is how many lobbying firms have, amongst other things, lobbied members of Congress to support higher defense budgets, to support a more aggressive foreign policy in developing nations, to ensure access to both raw materials and also access to markets. For example, very quickly, one of the reasons the United States eventually occupies the Philippines in the early 20th century as a result of the War of 1898 was there was a belief that we needed the Philippines to open up access to East Asian markets, especially in Japan and China. Later on, we realized that wasn't really the case, but a good chunk of U.S. foreign policy in the 20th century is all about opening markets. In fact, it is no coincidence that what we teach as the age of imperialism in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s coincides with the rise and fall of the populist movement, where American policy experts, American politicians are growing scared of growing worker power, both in the populist movement and the labor union movement as well. And they're saying we've got to find a way to grow the U.S. economy to make sure that workers and farmers are satisfied. They believe to do that, we have to find access to new markets, including China, Japan, also access to raw materials in the Pacific Ocean. Europe's doing this in Africa at the same time as well. So again, all these ideas and concepts, the nexus of imperialism and foreign policy on the one hand, and on the other hand, business policy and suppression of dissent at home, these things are all linked together for these various reasons.
That's a textbook definition of fascism, when the corporations and the government are working together.
Yes.
One, I want to thank Brett, Bursey, and all of them because the the student unrest on campus eventually led to the creation of University 101 in the first year seminar, which employs me. So thank you for that. Because as a way to try to, you know, bridge the division between professors and students. But my question is, obviously now we're seeing a student movement grow up, but we're not seeing that student movement happening on USC's campus in the same way that it did. And just any reflections on why the student movement has been so dormant and why, particularly in South Carolina, you don't see a student movement the way that you did.
Make him answer his own question. He's been paying attention. You know the answers.
Yeah, but I know my answers. I want
to. Your answer.
Well, I mean, one of them is because it's very, very expensive to be at a university and you're racking up a lot of debt. Another one is because there's not as much skin in the game directly. And another one is way busier than they've ever been in terms of what is expected of them in order to be employed adults. But I'm sure that there are other things as well that I'm not thinking about.
When I went to university, it was $900 for the semester. the whole thing. And so you have people that could, you know, go to college. And they've cut back on those humanitarian, what do they call them?
The
Humanities.
Yeah.
We're not very big on humanities now.
Yeah, I don't really see many of the Darla Moore students like protesting en masse. I can't really imagine that picture.
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
But why is that unique to Columbia? Because it doesn't seem to be the case on some of the other campuses. You know, there are, I mean, all of these Ivy League colleges where, and sure, they are getting, like, they're funded in different ways, but in a way they have more skin in the game because they have like family wealth that they're ultimately sacrificing.
Yeah.
But they also have more focus on humanities-based liberal arts classes, courses, and in South Carolina, you see a lot of focus on, and even in our high schools, they, students are, instead of going through your normal, well-rounded education, they're put through these fast tracks of science and STEM, which is very important, but also you miss that critical element of the humanities, which teaches critical thinking and empathy and all of that, space to think and learn from other regions. And so they're fast-tracked into our colleges, which focus primarily in those areas, and there's not a great focus. They call it a liberal arts university, but there's not a great focus in actually forcing students who are in the colleges of math and sciences to actually take humanities courses.
I would also add that a lot of the students who are coming to USC are out-of-state students, and they're being marketed the SEC experience of big football games and Greek life, and so they are not necessarily there for. And they're not tied to the community in any real way. I mean, they're USC is a world unto itself, and very few people are connected to the outside community who are there as students, especially if you're coming from like New Jersey or New York or Philadelphia, which is where a lot of the school is marketed to those regions.
Do they even know that there is a history of protest at the university?
Almost certainly not.
Yeah.
Well, and what I was gonna say is I'm from Columbia. I've never heard of any of these things. I have like parents who, went to Columbia College and, went to USC, and I lived in Forest Acres, which is not that far from the center of the city. And also like between Fort Jackson too. Never heard any of this stuff.
That's why I would really like to challenge. I know we're running really long, but I just wanted to challenge y'all while we're thinking about projects that we're thinking about doing, that I would hope one of the things that Josh is interested in doing, and I'm really interested in doing, is picking up the monuments tour, which was reimagining and reinventing the monuments that we have on the State House grounds. And we did this a couple of years, well, before the pandemic, with students from the school that went ahead and did a walking tour of the monuments. And Josh was talking about broadening that out to like doing a tour of like some of the sites like the UFO and, things that we're talking about tonight, and maybe even making it, I don't know how tight restrictions are in Fort Jackson, but it pisses me off, frankly, that folks don't know this history, because it gives me such hope to know that these people were out there fighting so hard at such personal risk, that I think that we should all take hope from that and courage from that, and be using this as an example for our children to how to be in the world, how to challenge authority, how to have ideas of your own, and have to act on your convictions. And that is what I love so much about these people that we've been talking about tonight, that they were so young and so brave. And that's what you guys can be too. And that's what I think they need examples of that. That's why I think that it's so tragic that there's not any reflection of that pushback in that Vietnam exhibit. So there's no history of those people at Fort Jackson. They should have a monument on Fort Jackson to those young people that stood up. It won't happen, but we should try to force that kind of awareness and reminding people of this really critical and rich history. And thank you, Hillary, for bringing that up, because it's important.
Let's close on that note, Dr.
Yeah,
Greene.
I could add a lot about my experience at Claflin with the students and why we don't have a student movement there, but I think that's actually a good place for us to pause. But don't forget, next Monday, class 11, we're doing political theory. We're taking what we've learned and taking a step back and asking ourselves the question, so how do we make sense of all of this? In particular, how do we make sense of the systems under which we live, under which we work, under which we basically breathe and suffer and complain about? How do we put these systems into a theoretical model that makes sense, that's actually useful for us? And we will have Lewis Pitts as our guest speaker next Monday. I've seen him several times speak to the class. He is a great and dynamic speaker. And like Brett, like Becky, like so many others in the class, he has been a true lifelong champion of human rights for all. So I'm really looking forward to next Monday's class. And I think it will give us some further context what we've discussed so far this semester and what we'll be discussing to finish out the semester too.
Thank you, Dr. Green.
Thank you.